Hello and welcome to the Election Security Panel. My name is Avi Rubin and I'm a computer science professor at Johns Hopkins University. The way this panel is going to work is each of the panelists is going to pre-record a short statement, maybe about 10 minutes, and you're going to see those now. And after that, we're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions. You can ask a question by typing it into the chat, and then I will read the questions to the panelists who will then answer them, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. So I worked on election security for many years. I was the director of an NSF center that was devoted to that issue. And when I was working on election security, the big issues were the secret ballot, privacy, audit, whether or not there was a dispute in the election, would we be able to recreate what happened? Could you do recounts? And a lot of the work and a lot of the controversy centered around paper ballots versus electronic voting. So today we're about to face an election and we are seeing unprecedented issues that are coming up. And it's not so much about whether we should use paper ballots. Paper ballots are actually being used almost everywhere now, thankfully. But the issue of vote by mail. And the reason obviously is with the COVID-19 crisis that we're undergoing, many people don't want to go to the polls. Justifiably, it could be dangerous and a more likely chance that they could be infected with the virus or catch it and infect other people. And so there's going to be a strong push to vote by mail. At the same time, the President of the United States has already gone on record to claim that there's a lot of fraud in vote by mail and that vote by mail is not reliable. And so we are headed perhaps for the perfect storm of this global pandemic, a president who is interested in challenging the results before the election even happens, who challenged the results last time even though he won, and a very supercharged public that is going to, I think, create a lot of drama in this election. And so I brought together some election security experts to give their thoughts. We have Alex Halderman, Ben Adida, and Vanessa Teague, who are going to provide excellent thoughts and commentary, and then we'll discuss issues with each other and with the audience. And so I'm confident that this is going to be a very interesting and engaging panel, especially for the USENIX security audience, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this. So with that, I will hand it off to our first speaker, who is Alex Halderman.
I'm Alex Halderman from the University of Michigan, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of the election cybersecurity landscape as we head into 2020. Election security changed forever 4 years ago when Russia committed cyber attacks against the 2016 US presidential election. You probably remember the targeted political leaks against the Hillary Clinton campaign and the bots and fake accounts on social media that waged a campaign the intelligence community has concluded was intended to sow discord and advantage Donald Trump. My focus today will be attacks against election infrastructure, the complex computer systems that handle the voting process. We know from the investigations of the intelligence community and the special counsel that Russian attackers probed election-related computer systems in all 50 states, and in multiple states, they were able to infiltrate the voter registration databases. They also infiltrated at least one election system vendor and attempted to infiltrate county and local election offices. The Russian attackers had the ability to change or destroy registration data, which would have caused massive chaos as voters showed up to the polls only to be told they weren't properly registered. We know they didn't change that data because there wasn't massive chaos in 2016, but it wasn't technology that stopped them. Nor is there any evidence that Russia changed votes, but once again, it wasn't technology that stopped them. My belief is that in both of these cases, Russia was stopped only because Vladimir Putin chose not to pull the trigger. As I told the Senate Intelligence Committee's Russia investigation 3 years ago, the key lesson from 2016 is that election infrastructure hacking threats are real. And as James Comey testified, we know they'll be back. And next time, they could do a lot more damage. That's because one of the persistent vulnerabilities in US election systems has been the voting machines themselves. There are many different models used across the country, but they break down into three main styles. We have a hand-marked optical scan, where voters fill out a paper ballot that gets counted by a computer after it's mailed in or deposited into a ballot box. We have BMDs, or ballot marking devices, on which voters cast a vote on a touchscreen and then have a paper ballot printed for them that they can deposit into an optical scanner. BMDs are widely used for accessibility. Finally, we have DRE, or direct recording electronic voting machines, on which voters cast a vote on a touchscreen that gets recorded entirely within computer memory. Some models also print a paper trail called a VVPAT, but those are increasingly rare. Our community has been studying vulnerabilities in voting machines for many years, going back to a paper that Avi co-authored in 2003. Since then, we've studied dozens of different models, including optical scanners and DREs, and in virtually every case, researchers have discovered vulnerabilities that would enable attackers to steal votes. How hard would it be to exploit these vulnerabilities to change the outcome of a national election? Actually, a lot easier than it might seem. Using pre-election polls, attackers could identify likely swing states and scan them all for vulnerabilities, as Russia did in 2016. Next, the attackers would infiltrate jurisdictions or service providers that operate election management systems, computers that are used to program the voting machines before every election. From there, they could spread malware to voting machines throughout the jurisdiction and reprogram them to change the digital records of a small fraction of votes. Even if each vote is also recorded on a piece of paper, the unfortunate reality is that most states will throw away the paper ballots without having rigorously checked them. As a result, an attack could change the outcome of a national election, and we might never find out. Fortunately, we know a practical way to defend against vote-stealing attacks without requiring any security breakthroughs. It's a simple formula. Record every vote on a paper ballot and check the machine counts using a statistically rigorous audit of the paper. This approach has been endorsed by the national academies and a growing number of election administrators. Paper might seem like a step backwards, but security experts know better. We want critical systems to have physical fail-safes whenever possible. Although passenger jets use computer navigation, they're still required by law to have a magnetic compass in the cockpit. And when you ride in a car, you really want there to be a physical linkage between the brake pedal and the brakes, just in case the computers fail or get hacked. It's the same with paper ballots and voting. Of course, there's a long history of fraud involving tampering with old-fashioned paper ballots. That's why modern optical scan voting systems create a digital record of every vote as it's cast. As long as we check the digital records against the paper records to make sure they agree, an attacker would have to change them both to escape detection. We don't even need to inspect every ballot. That's because in recent years, statisticians have developed highly efficient methods for using paper ballots to verify election results, known as risk-limiting audits. In an RLA, workers hand count randomly selected ballots until they establish, with high probability, that hand counting all the paper ballots would yield the same winner. Most elections aren't close, so the audit can be completed using just a small random sample. So we have a blueprint for securing elections. How far have we come over the last 4 years? There's been a lot of progress, but elections still face some major security challenges. I think the most important advance compared to 2016 is that there's now a vastly greater awareness of election cybersecurity threats. There's also increased cooperation between the federal government and state and local officials. The past 4 years have also seen important upgrades to many state voter registration systems, including intrusion detection capabilities and penetration testing, as well as updates to polling place equipment across many jurisdictions. More recently, several states have even started implementing or piloting risk-limiting audits. On the whole, though, significant weaknesses remain, and despite major investments, U.S. elections are still a patchwork of strength and weakness. This spotty performance is due in part to Congress, which provided states with $1.2 billion in new election funds, but didn't impose any security standards or requirements. Consequently, heading into the 2020 election, U.S. voting systems still face several serious challenges. The first challenge is continued use of unauditable paperless voting. Since 2016, the fraction of paperless votes has fallen from 24% to 14% today, but 9 states still don't record every vote on paper. Meanwhile, the fraction of votes cast on hand-marked paper ballots has actually fallen from 75% to 65%. The reason is that many jurisdictions have replaced obsolete paperless machines with ballot marking devices for all voters. These BMDs are the second challenge. BMDs are essential for voters with disabilities, but some officials favor using them for everyone, for reasons that Ben will explain. The problem is that if BMDs are hacked, they could mark different candidates than what voters selected on screen. No audit could catch this cheating, since the paper trail itself would be wrong. In principle, voters could detect this by reviewing the printouts. But when we tested this by asking people to vote on BMDs that we hacked ourselves, voters reported fewer than 7% of errors. In a close election, that would mean voters would report much less than one problem per polling place on average, even if the BMDs had cheated on enough ballots to steal the election. Encouraging voters to review the printouts seems to help somewhat, but the effect is not clearly large enough to detect fraud in close elections when all voters use BMDs, as is the case for jurisdictions where 20% of voters live. Notably, using BMDs exclusively for accessibility, as most other jurisdictions do, requires only a much lower and more realistic rate of voter verification. The next challenge is that even though 41 states now have a paper record of every vote, barely half audit the paper trail before declaring the election winner. Even then, only 2 states, Colorado and Rhode Island, require these audits to be risk-limiting. In the rest, the audit will sometimes examine too few ballots to detect fraud with high probability. There is some good news. 9 other states either allow RLAs or are piloting them, so we might see a few more in November. But there's a lot more work to do to ensure that computer counts everywhere are rigorously scrutinized. COVID-19 poses enormous new challenges for in-person voting. In response, 17 states have adopted changes to make it easier to vote by mail. Mail-in voting does introduce new security risks, and in fact most confirmed cases of voter fraud involve absentee ballots. But the evidence points to hundreds of instances, not millions as sometimes claimed, and attacking large numbers of mail-in ballots would require a large conspiracy and leave abundant physical evidence. The bigger worry is that the rapid expansion of vote by mail will leave officials insufficiently prepared and voters confused about the new rules. It also ensures that a meltdown at the Postal Service would cause widespread chaos in November. COVID is also increasing pressure on states to allow greater use of online voting. Just last month, Delaware allowed anyone to cast a ballot using a web portal. Of course, this is crazy. 10 years ago, I hacked Washington, D.C.'s online voting pilot and changed all the votes in just 48 hours. It's foolish to think that adversaries like Russia couldn't do the same. Someday, the excellent line of research into end-to-end verifiable cryptographic voting schemes might let us vote online safely, but that still seems years away, and the systems marketed in the U.S. now are not verifiable or secure. Last but not least, U.S. elections face a separate challenge on top of ensuring integrity, ensuring that the outcome is perceived as legitimate. As an old saying goes, elections need to convince the losers that they lost. Even absent an attack, a chaotic November could create the appearance of impropriety, which would be easy fodder for misinformation and make the outcome hard for much of the country to accept. To me, the underlying problem is that U.S. elections too often demand faith in opaque technology, processes, and public servants. Instead, we should be engineering them to generate evidence of their correctness through transparency and observability that anyone who cares can check. With just 83 days until the presidential election, there are still things you can do to help. Volunteer as a poll worker. There's no better way to understand the challenges. Get involved in election-related research. Most importantly, vote. Looking ahead, the next Congress has an opportunity to make U.S. elections vastly more secure by setting minimum standards that provide for paper ballots, risk-limiting audits, and other security practices. Election security is complex, but these simple steps will put us much closer to election outcomes that everyone can believe in. Thank you.
Hi, I'm excited to be here on this panel with my colleagues Avi Rubin, Alex Halderman, and Vanessa Teague. My talk is entitled Don't Attribute to Malice. My name is Ben. I'm the Executive Director of VotingWorks. VotingWorks is a nonpartisan nonprofit working to build a secure, affordable, and open source voting system for the US. We started a little more than a year and a half ago. This is our first prototype. Thankfully, my 8-year-old helped with some of the QA, and this was the first model that we created in August of 2019, a little more than a year ago, with a touchscreen on the left and a printer that prints out the ballot connected to it on the right. We deployed the system for the first time almost exactly a year ago in one precinct in one county, Choctaw County, Mississippi, and the election went pretty well. We got some feedback. We tested it, including with voters with disabilities. We created the new version of the system with the poll worker check-in station on the left, the ballot marking station in the middle, and the ballot printing station on the right. All of these are easy to unpack and set up and pack up again at the end of the day. You'll notice that we separated the ballot marking station from the ballot printing station so that a single precinct that may need 5, 6, up to 10 ballot marking devices actually now only needs one printer and maybe a second one as a backup. What's really important about that is that our entire system is now a lot easier to haul into the precinct by poll workers and consumes significantly less power than some other competing systems. In fact, as little as 1/10 the power requirement that other systems may have. We found out over the last few weeks that this is actually super important, as some states have had trouble with equipment consuming too much power at the precinct. We assembled almost 100 units in my garage, ran the November gubernatorial election for the whole Choctaw County in Mississippi, and eventually the presidential primary in March. And this is the tabulation part at the end of the day with the election officials for the county using the scanner that we provide to tabulate all those ballots. We also had a deployment in Wisconsin for a small test election with our friends at Microsoft. Most recently, we've been working on hand-marked paper ballots, producing them and scanning them, as well as all the additional equipment like envelopes that you might need to do vote by mail. And beyond that, we also work on open source software to run risk-limiting audits, of which we expect 5, 6, maybe 7 statewide risk-limiting audits this November. Occasionally, we have trouble getting printers through the door too. We can build much better voting systems than what's out there today. But we shouldn't attribute to malice what can be explained by ignorance or stupidity. And we're all ignorant and stupid at times, so this is not meant to be an attack on any one party. And we shouldn't attribute to stupidity what may be a requirement that we don't understand. Let me give you 2 examples. QR code ballots and ballot marking devices. Let's talk about QR code ballots. If you've heard about these barcode ballots, you might be worried about something like this. Just a barcode and no candidate text. That's terrible. How can you possibly tell who you voted for? Here's the good news. No machine on the market does that today. This is what the ballots look like. On the left, other vendors' ballots. On the right, our ballot at VotingWorks. There are barcodes on these ballots, but there is also human-readable text, so you can see it. Now, what if the barcode doesn't match the text? Shouldn't we be OCRing this? Come on, right? That would be your reaction if you're a paranoid security person, of which I hear there might be a few in the audience today. And that's a reasonable first reaction, but you have to understand the requirements. The requirement, and it's a good one, is that these scanners have to scan 10 million ballot positions accurately, and they have to do it fast. a few ballots per second. We cannot do that with OCR today. That's why there is a machine-readable version of the ballot on those ballots. It's not for any stupid reason. It's not for any nefarious reason. It's because it's necessary. Now, you might still be worried about the security of it, but here's the deal. This problem exists with bubble ballots too. The position of the bubble is what decides what the ballot is for. So if there's a misprint, and those misprints have happened plenty of times before, what you think you're filling out on a bubble ballot might actually be counted differently. The human-readable and the machine-readable version of the ballot may be different, whether it's a bubble ballot or a QR code ballot. And yes, I know the QR code looks scarier, but it's not actually any worse. The way you fix the problem, either way, is with an audit at the end, because if there's a mismatch between the human-readable and the machine-readable, that will show up. And thankfully, if you run a risk-limiting audit on the tabulation, which you should be doing anyways for other reasons to check the tabulator, you will catch these issues too. So for free, you can protect against this issue. In other words, as long as there is human-readable text on the ballot, barcodes are not a problem. Okay. Example number 2, ballot marking devices themselves, right? These are machines that voters use to prepare and print their ballot. And you might want to ask, and many people do ask, these ballot marking devices, they look all fancy. Are we just, throwing technology at a problem that could be solved just with a pen? Come on, $3,500 or more in some cases. Okay, ours is a lot less expensive, but $3,500 or a $1 pen? Come on. Here's the requirement. Voters with disabilities deserve a secret ballot too. You may hear this and think, okay, but that's an edge case. We're really not going to design this whole thing around an edge case, are we? It's not an edge case. More than 10 million voters in the US have visual impairments that make it difficult for them to read the 10 or 12 point font on a ballot. And you know what else? Most of us are only temporarily abled. If we're lucky, we grow old and can't read 12-point font. So we need these BMDs. And thankfully, this is codified in the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines and the Help America Vote Act, that voters with disabilities have the right to a secret ballot that they can cast independently. That's the requirement. And there's more. A number of states have implemented vote centers. Now think back, way back, 6, 7, 8 months ago, when you actually used to leave your home to go to work, and work was not just another space in your home. A vote center lets you vote anywhere in the county, sometimes early before Election Day, and having these vote centers, where any voter from the county can vote, now means that the vote center needs dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of different ballot styles available right away, and sometimes a dozen languages in which to have those ballots available. Having paper ballots available in all of those combinations is quite tricky. But if you have a BMD, the right ballot in the right language can just show up on the screen. That's a huge advantage operationally. Another thing you might say is like, fine, in some cases I can see the need for the BMD, but I want my hand-marked paper ballot. And by the way, I tend to agree. I think voters should have a choice. But let's understand what the choice means. The choice means that poll workers now need to manage 2 different flows at the precinct. They get 2 hours of training. So I do think voters should have a choice. But I think we should try to understand why certain counties choose to go all BMDs. It's because it's actually hard to have both. Let's at least understand that, even if we think that maybe voters should have a choice. That's all the reasons why we need BMDs. Because many voters need them to independently cast a secret ballot, and because it makes operations of an election, when we want to enfranchise as many voters as possible with vote centers, etc., it makes that so much easier. Also, in practice, the security fears of BMDs are, in my opinion, overblown. And the main thing I want to say about that is, you can check your ballot. It's a piece of paper that comes out of a printer and you can look at it and you can see what you voted for. It's right there. This is not like the touchscreen voting machines of yore where it just got recorded on some hard drive and you can't check it. You can check the ballot. That is the ballot of record. And we have a number of studies, including this excellent Oakland 2020 paper from Dr. Matt Bernhardt and Professor Halderman, that tell us that if voters review the ballot, they can find errors. This is a fear that people have, that maybe they don't remember how they voted and whatnot. They can find errors, especially for the top level contests. So we have some hope that this can work well. More than hope, we have some data that voters can verify their ballot. Yes, there are still risks. There are risks in every stage of an election. And I think in practice, when you think about the entire flow of what can go wrong in an election, the idea that the BMD is going to maliciously misprint your ballot even though you have a chance to check it is not the top concern that I have, especially when you weigh that against what it would mean if you didn't give voters the choice to use a BMD when so many of them need it. The BMDs are here to stay as part of the solution. We should be working more on securing them than on trying to push them out. So, to be clear, I'm not saying that today's BMDs are perfect. After all, I'm doing this work because I think they're far from perfect. They need to be much better designed for voter verifiability. They need to be cheaper. They need to be much more resilient to various issues and failures and low power situations and no power situations. They need to leverage modern security practices like Secure Boot and beyond. We need to do better. So, in conclusion, we can build much better voting systems, but as we look to do so, we should not attribute to stupidity what may actually simply be a requirement we didn't previously understand. And one more thing. Election officials are the real heroes here. They only get press, and it's always bad press when something goes wrong. They never get good press when things go well. They are the real heroes. They've always been the real heroes, and they will be especially the real heroes this year in times of COVID. You can help by signing up to be a poll worker. I really encourage you to do that. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
My talk is trying to understand what we can and cannot do in order to secure elections. I'm Vanessa Teague, and this is joint work with a whole lot of other people who are listed on the slide. First of all, I want to try to understand what problems are easy and what problems are hard. When you first start looking at an engineering problem, you don't immediately know whether it's a really easy problem that has never been looked at hard before, or whether it's a really challenging problem. So I'm going to talk about two problems in election security. The first one is risk-limiting audits for instant runoff voting, and I'm going to show that that's actually much easier than we thought. If you look 5 or 10 years back into the literature, you'll see a lot of references to risk-limiting audits for instant runoff voting that say basically that it's intractable. Well, in fact, it's not intractable, and we have a very practical solution that I'm going to overview briefly today. The second thing I want to talk about is secure voting over the internet, a problem that I've been working on for more than a decade now. And basically every time I look at the problem afresh, I think of a new reason that it's much harder than I thought. So the more we learn about voting over the internet, the more intractable it seems, and the more we can think of disastrous ways that it could go wrong. So first of all, the good news. Let's talk about instant runoff voting. This is a form of voting already very common in Australia, already in use in Canada and in Northern Ireland and a bunch of other places, and increasingly adopted in the United States, San Francisco, parts of Colorado. The idea is that rather than selecting just your favourite candidate, you select your favourite candidate and your second favourite candidate and your third favourite candidate and so on. And the first round of the count is exactly what you'd expect. We count everybody's first preferences. And if someone gets more than 50% of the votes, then they win outright. If they don't, then we remove the candidate who has the least support, and for each person who voted for them, we eliminate them from the election and shift up the preferences of each vote and then recount as if that candidate hadn't been there. So the voter's second choice becomes their first choice, and their third choice becomes their second choice, and so forth. And then we recount, and we keep doing this until somebody gets a majority. Not a plurality, a majority. So that's great. It's actually a really good counting algorithm, which I love, although I acknowledge that not everybody does. I love, in Australia, being able to put a first preference against my true favourite candidate, who is usually not a major party candidate, and then I like to choose between the major parties with my subsequent preferences. However, One challenge in instant runoff voting is that it's quite hard to figure out the margin, and it's sometimes even hard to figure out the true runner-up. And you don't really know, or it wasn't really known, how to run efficient risk-limiting audits of an IRV election. So a risk-limiting audit is a statistical method of testing an announced election result. And the rule is that the definition of a risk-limiting audit is that we should have a bounded probability of mistakenly accepting the wrong election result. So what we do is we gather statistical evidence either in support of or against the election result, and we either terminate and say, yep, we're happy with this election result, or we consider that there has been too much error or that the results are unconvincing, and then we do a full manual recount. Either way, we get to the end of the election with some confidence that we didn't mistakenly accept a wrong result, except with very small probability. So let's look at how we might attempt to apply this idea to instant runoff voting. Well, it turns out we can. After many years of Australian and American research, we can do RLAs for IRV. First of all, we run some Australian code to analyse the outcome and find the most easily tested set of assertions which imply the announced outcome if they turn out to be true, and I'll show you at least where to find the code for that in a minute. Then we can test those assertions with an RLA. And we really tried it. This is not just theoretical work. We conducted the first pilot audit of an instant runoff election in San Francisco at the end of last year. This was for the quite controversial San Francisco DA's race, and we did a pilot risk-limiting audit of just the vote-by-mail ballots, which unfortunately actually got a different winner from the overall election result. So really all we tested was that the announced winner, if you just counted the vote-by-mail ballots, was actually different from the overall winner. But the point is that if we look at quantifying how efficient these techniques can be for a substantial level of confidence, we find that we get a very, very, very low risk limit out of really quite a small number of sample ballots. We got a risk well below 5% with a sample of only about 200 IRV ballots. Here's a picture of the pilot audit. And the nice thing about it is all of the code is open source, and you can go and double check the results if you like. Of course, you could only see the actual sampled paper ballots if you were one of the citizens who chose to show up and watch, but all of the other calculations, all of the code, and everything else is still online and you can still check. So we can do risk-limiting audits for instant runoff voting, and that problem turns out to be a lot easier than we originally thought. Which now brings me to internet voting, which is harder and harder every time we think about it. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes, just a very brief overview of some issues we found in the cryptography of a system that was going to be used in Swiss elections. If you want to see more of the geek details, they're in my Woot talk, but the short summary is we found two bugs, both in parts of the system that was supposed to provide very sophisticated cryptographic proofs that the election outcome had been computed correctly. This proof consisted of shuffling proof and a decryption proof. We found two bugs. One was in the shuffling proof and one was in the decryption proof. Here's a little example of a set of input ciphertexts that we claim to be shuffled to appropriately produce that set of output ciphertexts. And if you know a little bit about how Al-Gamal encryption works, you can see immediately that these ciphertexts are not the same at all. And yet we successfully produced a zero-knowledge proof, which purported to demonstrate that this was, in fact, a valid shuffle. The shuffle passed verification, both in theory by looking at the spec and also by running the practical tests that came with the code. You can see this and other example proof transcripts at that link. So there was an error in the cryptography of the system, which broke verifiability, an absolutely core requirement for Swiss internet voting. The exploitation of the trapdoor is undetectable, and in fact the fake proof transcripts are indistinguishable from true, validly generated proof transcripts. It's probably just a dumb mistake, but it's also exactly the kind of mistake that a malicious attacker would potentially insert in order for it to be explained away as a dumb mistake if it was found. And in particular, it's a trapdoor, for those who like this kind of thing, which has a flavour very similar to the trapdoor in the dual EC-DRBG algorithm. There are two parameters. The system is provably hard to manipulate if it is hard to compute the discrete logarithm of one parameter with respect to the other parameter, and yet these two parameters are allowed to be just sort of produced without proof that they were produced in a way that nobody knows the discrete log. Okay, so at least in Switzerland, we were talking about a system which was being made openly available for review months before it was intended to be used. Unfortunately, the same system was already in use in my home country of Australia in the neighbouring state of New South Wales. And this newspaper article pretty much sums up the attitude. It says, New South Wales Electoral Commission confirms iVote contains critical cital crypto defect, but declares it unaffected and safe for upcoming election. So they knew they had the bug, but they just decided to use it anyway. They claimed they patched it, but of course nobody could check. But surely New South Wales has a law mandating open public access to the source code, right? Don't they? Well, no, actually, they have a law that mandates keeping the source code secret. Anyway, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we'd fixed the bug, at least in Switzerland they did. So now everything is perfectly secure, right? Well, actually, the shuffle proof was a shuffle and decryption proof, remember? Let's have a look at the decryption part. Turns out there's an equally serious bug in the decryption part that allows us to fake a decryption proof and thus turn a valid vote into nonsense while providing an apparently verifying but completely false proof that we decrypted correctly. This flaw was much more serious for Switzerland because it affected systems that were already in use. And this got a lot of public attention, including from the Swiss Federal Chancellor, who is smiling in this photo but not happy at all. In New South Wales, the Electoral Commission simply put out a press release saying that it was not relevant, which was not true. It was immediately obvious months after the election, when they published the code, that in fact it was highly relevant to them. So the lessons firstly are that good regulations make a huge difference. Switzerland had really detailed requirements and really strong transparency rules, and they found out about the problems in their system. New South Wales only noticed there was a problem because the Swiss transparency rules brought New South Wales problems to light. So I think internet voting is probably going to only seem harder the more we try it and the more effort we put into understanding the problem. I think there's a certain brittleness about it that makes it really hard to guarantee that purely cryptographic protections are absolutely bulletproof. That's why I really like designs like the Election Guard or StarVote design that are deliberately designed around the redundancy of a paper audit trail, so that even if there is something badly wrong with the crypto, you still have the paper to fall back on. And I actually think that some of the most interesting future directions in this field, at least my current favourite problem, is adapting something of that hybrid cryptography and paper approach to a remote setting, with the idea being to try to approach something that isn't any worse than postal voting, but also perhaps uses some cryptography to provide some evidence about proper inclusion of the vote.
Okay, I think that's the end of our pre-recorded presentations. I hope that everybody's getting used to this format. I know that it's new for me, new way to do conferences. I'm happy to tell you I just bought this privacy screen that you see behind me, so you no longer have to see what you don't want to know what's back there anyway. And I see other new things about this format. For example, Alex and Ben commenting and not paying attention during their own talks and talking to people on the Slack, which I thought was great. And And so I want to share with you a quick thing that happened to me and lead into my first question. And then after the panelists can address my question, I've been copy pasting some of the questions that are showing up on Slack, and I'll present those to the panelists. So what happened to me is during this COVID time, my family and I are living in another house, not in our house that we normally live in. And we forwarded our mail to this new house. And then when it came time to vote in the primary, we had requested absentee ballots because of COVID. We didn't want to go to the polling place. And we never got the absentee ballots. And we called up the Board of Elections, and it turns out that they won't forward ballots if you have mail forwarding. And so as someone who cares about voting as one of my favorite absolute things in the whole world, I didn't get to vote in the primary. And so now what I've done for the general election is canceled mail forwarding and driving back and forth between the houses to get the mail. It's about an hour drive, but I definitely want to make sure I get to vote. So the question I have is, what can we do to make vote by mail more secure, and what can we do to increase people's confidence in vote by mail? And there was also a question on the list from a participant here about the chain of custody of paper ballot. So whoever wants to take that, if you go first, you win, unmute, and I will mute while you answer. I think
you can go.
Go
Alex.
ahead, Ben.
If you touch your nose, then you don't have to answer. And someone.
All right, I'm happy to go first. I think the main thing I'll say about vote by mail, the main thing that everyone should understand about vote by mail, is that there's, when COVID started, people were like, oh, that's fine. Everybody will just vote by mail. No big deal. Turns out operating a vote by mail election is fairly complex. And you've got all sorts of edge cases like the one you just mentioned, Avi, right? Where people move, or the election office doesn't actually have your latest address on record, because if you're used to voting in person, they don't strictly need your latest address on record. It's not the end of the world if you come in and say, I live at 123 Easy Street, and they go, no, that's not what I have. And you go, oh, you probably have like 456 Blue Street. Yes, okay, good, that's me, and I can go on, right? So the records don't have to be up to date if you're voting in person, but they really have to be up to date if you're voting by mail. That's just one of the many, many issues. So I think, how do you get good at vote by mail? Practice, practice, practice. And this is one of the dangers that Alex mentioned. When we're rapidly ramping up vote by mail, we don't get to practice, practice, practice. And so it's going to be hard, right? It's going to be really hard. Another thing I'll mention that we spent a lot of time looking into this at VotingWorks this year is the vote by mail world has not been productized. By that, I mean, every county goes off and builds their own vote by mail product. Now, there are some resources they can make use of that are fantastic. The Center for Civic Design has envelope designs that you can borrow. The folks in Colorado and the Vote at Home folks have produced best practices and timelines and whatnot that are really fantastic. But if you're a county and you want to deploy vote by mail at scale, you have to go, you can take those resources, but then you still have to kind of assemble all the components by yourself. One of the things that we've been working on building at VotingWorks, and unfortunately it won't be ready to significantly help this year, but we're hoping it'll be ready in future years, is the ability for a county to sign up with us or with somebody else who wants to offer this and very rapidly get all the best practices implemented and deployed in vote by mail. It's not going to solve everything, but if you saw the Gantt charts that counties have to go through right now to deploy vote by mail, it's just so many places that they have to implement new process and so many places to fail. So I'll pause there.
Well, let me follow up, because I absolutely agree with Ben that the biggest challenges we have with vote by mail now are logistical, or just getting to the point where large numbers of people are familiar with the process, where jurisdictions have the necessary procedures in place, et cetera. But thinking as a security problem a little bit more, we know from past prosecutions of electoral fraud that a lot of it does happen with absentee ballots. But as I said in my talk, the number of cases that have been prosecuted are probably in the high hundreds in recent years. We're not talking about things where we have any evidence that fraud takes place on a scale of millions. And the main reason for that seems to be that the attacks have to be retail level. That is, you're attacking one ballot at a time. On the other hand, there is a kind of central point of failure in vote by mail too, which is the post office itself, which is a kind of large and complex system with its own dependence on technology and certainly on administrative processes and on the correct functioning of government. So if we think of the Postal Service itself as a point of attack, I think that could be a major weakness in vote by mail systems. And even now, as we're witnessing problems with reports of cascading delays in mail delivery and so forth, you could model that as a kind of denial of service attack against participation through the mail. And I think we're likely to see potential problems with computerized mail processing as well become a potential for vulnerability in vote by mail.
One concern that I have is I see on the social media jungle out there claims that the delays that we're seeing in the postal mail are intentional, and I think we're just headed for an election whose result the losing side is going to blame anything they possibly can, and they may say that the postal system was sabotaged on purpose in order to hurt the election, where there were going to be a lot more than usual vote by mail. So let's move on from there to another question. I'll ask one more question, and then I'll start with the participant questions. So Ben, would it make sense, and I didn't think I heard you mention this, you know how sometimes you're in a store and you want to know how much something costs and it has a barcode on it, so you just walk up to the machine and you have it scan the barcode and it shows you the price. And I was thinking, with the ballots that you have that have the barcode in the top right, if you could have at the polls such a machine that had a display, you could just take the barcode and have it read it and display it. Now, yes, you could argue if somebody were cheating, they would cheat there, but maybe this is built to some known spec by an independent party, and this would be a way to increase people's confidence.
Yeah. So first, I won't answer your question, then I will answer your question. So I'm not going to answer your question by saying we found that the QR code is scary to voters if it is prominent and that's all they see, right? And there are a lot of ballots out there that have a giant QR code and then tiny little font underneath it. So it looks like there's a QR code and then some dirt on your ballot, right? And that's legitimately scary, and then they wonder what it is. We've tried in our design to make the font significantly more prominent, and the QR code is there and they see it, but it's not in the way. So is that a security answer? No, not really, because it doesn't change the security model, right? But when voters are worried, that's the main reason they're worried about it. And thinking about the design actually influences the outcome, because you want voters to trust it. And then the trust is actually engendered by the RLA on the back end, right? Which is how you get it. Could you do what you described? Yes, absolutely. Like I said, I think on the security front, if both machines are coming out of VotingWorks, it's like, oh, well, great. You just, you can cheat one way and cheat the same way in the machine, right? And then putting it in open spec makes a ton of sense. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that there are many ballot styles, there are many election definitions. A lot of these QR codes contain a highly compressed version of the data because they can't contain the whole election definition. And so you'd have to have the election definition to be able to map that against that. And so what you need then is interoperable data formats for everything, for the election and all that stuff. There is a lot of great work going on coming out of NIST on the common data formats that would enable this kind of stuff. And I'm a huge proponent of that. So yes to your idea, but there's a lot of steps to get there that aren't there yet.
Sure. Well, and Avi, one of the problems is in many voting machines, many BMDs that are used now, that barcode is actually encrypted so that you as the voter, even if you had your own device to scan it or whatever, you probably wouldn't be able to make any sense of it. So even beyond it just being coded. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be that way. But I think I agree with Ben in part and strongly disagree in another part. And we both agree that as long as there's human readable text, it's verified by the voter, and it's strongly audited, then any problem is going to get caught. And that's ultimately, I think, where we need to get to in order to have strong confidence in election integrity. Now, where I disagree is as an interim matter. So we have the problem that there are many jurisdictions now that are using BMDs for all voters and are not performing an audit. And what this means, if there are barcode-based BMDs, is that an attack against the BMDs that changes the barcode, or an attack against the scanner that changes the count, would both be a route that was able to change the final counts. So instead of having just one vulnerable system or potentially vulnerable system to attack, now you have your choice of two. And that seems to me to be materially worse.
I'll add one thing, but I will note that we are crowding out our co-panelist, Vanessa, who hasn't said anything. So
I was actually going to address the next question, the first audience question to Vanessa.
Let me add one quick little detail, and then I'll shut up for, I promise. I think the one thing that's like obvious with a QR code is you could mess with the QR code, and Alex is completely right. You could mess with the QR code. The part that's less obvious, and I try to say it in the talk, but it's so hard to convey, is you can mess with the timing marks and the printing of bubble ballots too, right? And I don't know if it's happened on purpose, but it certainly has happened by accident, where ballots have been printed where bubbles are not quite perfectly aligned with the timing marks, and it leads to significant undercount of votes. And the only time those have been detected, by the way, is when the printing is so off that a candidate gets like 3 votes out of 100,000, and then they go, well, something must have gone wrong, and they go back to the ballots and they detect it. But if it's off by a little bit, and maybe a candidate loses 5 to 10%, you would never catch that without an audit, right? And so I know the QR code is scarier, and I know that it, you know, the fact that it's like printed on demand might feel like it's an additional threat compared to the pre-printed stuff. But remember, the pre-printed ballots are outsourced to private printing firms that are usually local. They could easily inject 5 or 10% mistake in that stack. You wouldn't know if a bubble is slightly off. So now I'll be quiet for a while. Even if Alex responds, I'll still be quiet.
Actually, let me cut it off.
Let's go to Vanessa. Come on.
We could talk for hours, and in fact, we have questions later about the barcodes. But next question, we're going to take. I'm going to direct it to Vanessa. I think it's actually fits well with what you were talking about a bit. It's from. I hope I'm not butchering this name too badly. Phoebe Rouge, who is from the Federal Trade Commission in D.C. And I'll just read it. A more general question. I wonder how the pressure to return results quickly, with delays potentially causing the legitimacy to be called into question, trades off with the time needed to check that the results are correct. As in, do some election officials use the time needed to do audits as a reason not to do them or do them less thoroughly, or prefer a less auditable technology versus a faster one to provide aggregate results?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the discussion that I've seen is actually really sad in that speed seems to be valued very, very highly when really accuracy is the thing that should be valued. I've seen this in lots and lots of different countries. In particular, the Australian Electoral Commission is very resistant to doing audits. And they say quite openly that they're not keen to do it because they know it would slow down the process. And I say, well, yes, of course it would slow down the process, and you'd get much higher confidence in the accuracy of your election result, right? But unfortunately, that's not the universal view. I do know of at least one example in which suspicious speed was regarded as too much speed was regarded as suspicious. I have some students and friends who came from Iran after the very contested election they had there back in, I think it was 2012. And they said one of the things that was really suspicious about that election was that the answer was announced too quickly. So nobody really believed that they'd actually counted the ballots. So overall, I think both in Australia and I gather in the United States, there's a belief that fast election results are a good thing and that they indicate something positive about integrity, when in fact exactly the opposite is true. I think we should really encourage a tolerance, or indeed a requirement, for slow and careful checking of the results.
And if you do steal the election, build in a delay so they don't think that you just faked it all.
I don't know. Yeah.
Does any of the other panelists want to comment about this? So let me.
We're gonna have delayed results in the U.S. this year because of vote by mail. Just know that, right? Like that is inescapable. Like there's a very strong chance we won't know the winner the night of the election or even the next day.
Yeah, and you know, it's happened a few times in our presidential elections already. So maybe we're going to start getting used to that.
And I think we should be careful not to demand that any of the candidates commit to accepting the results immediately after election night, because it probably will be true that some results not only will come in late, but some results may have to be challenged and further scrutinized before we know for sure what the outcome was.
Okay, this next question is from Jenny Blessing, and it is, how do we overcome barriers to access in doing technical evaluations of election systems? Private vendors are notoriously resistant to allowing security researchers access to their systems, since they have little incentive to encourage potentially damaging security reports, which means that there are entire sections of the election ecosystem, like e-poll books, that have never been publicly looked at. What would be some of the first step towards encouraging vendor cooperation?
Boy, can I start that? I guess we've seen one small but encouraging step just this past week, where ES&S, one of the big vendors, finally did adopt a vulnerability disclosure policy in which they promise not to sue people who responsibly disclose vulnerabilities in their systems. Now, there's still no way to get access to their current voting systems. So you might think that this is moot, but it's still, at least symbolically, a positive step, because hopefully it will encourage other election vendors to follow suit, and we can maybe turn down the temperature a little bit in the room when it comes to cooperation between the security universe and major election vendors. Personally, though, I do think it should be easier for researchers to get access to voting machines. I mean, of course, we want there to be additional scrutiny. Now, whether that is going to be making machines available to just anyone who wants to look at them, I don't know. That might well increase security risks in the short term. But at least through some kind of cooperative program with known institutions and researchers, I think we could get much better at soliciting the help and really the often free penetration testing that comes from thorough security scrutiny.
Yeah, I completely agree with Alex. I'm much more of an extremist on this one. At VotingWorks, everything we do is open source, and on our GitHub right now, you can go get all of our source code. We could probably spend more time documenting how you would build it all onto the right hardware, and we will. But the point is, we are trying to set an example that everything related to elections should be fully transparent. We do not make claims, nor would we ever want us to make claims that the open source aspect guarantees security. That's not how it works, right? Because you still have to know that the right code is installed in the machine and all that stuff, right? But that level of transparency, both in how machines are operated and how they run, I strongly believe should be how we do things. I think the federal government and the states, California does have a mandatory disclosure policy for things that are systems that are certified in California. It's not the same thing as giving Alex and his students access to hardware to test, right? But it is a step in the direction of disclosure and that kind of thing. And I think the states and the federal government could do more in this front.
Okay, but there's one more important point, which is that if we got to the place where I think all of us would like to see election technology where you have a physical record and it's audited, then the reliance on the secure state of the voting machine itself is significantly reduced, maybe to the point where there's a lot less need for such scrutiny. If we're manually verifying that the outcome is correct, then yes, there's still a risk to privacy or of denial of service. But the incentive to attack the voting machines in the first place would be much less.
So unfortunately, I have a dozen or so great questions that I was dying to read to you from the participants, but we have less than a minute left. This is obviously a really hot topic, and there's another presentation coming right on the heels of ours. So I'll let you each
Vanessa the last-
say in
Can we give
15
Vanessa
seconds some final words, and then we'll have to thank everybody and let USENIX move on. So go ahead, maybe in the same order you spoke before, 10 seconds.
I yield my time to Vanessa. I spoke too much. Go, Vanessa.
Yield.
Verifiability is everything. I think you have to be directly checking the election result in a, and the verification process itself has to be completely transparent too. So a bunch of observers should be allowed to stand around and watch that the verification process is happening.
All right, I will say this was a fantastic panel to a set of panelists to work with. It was a great topic. I really enjoyed it. I hope next year to see you in person, all of you somewhere. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.